There is a moment right before you speak, a half second of stillness where your mind is loaded, your breath is drawn, and the room is waiting. Most people rush through that moment. They fill it with noise because silence feels unbearable, like a gap that has to be patched before someone notices it's there. But the most powerful people you have ever met, the ones who walked into a room and changed its temperature without lifting a finger, understood something the rest of us were never taught. They understood that the moment before you speak is not empty. It is loaded with power. And if you learn to live inside that moment instead of escaping it, you will command more respect than any clever sentence could ever earn you. This is not a video about being quiet because you have nothing to say. It is not about shyness, timidity, or holding your tongue out of fear. This is about a different kind of silence entirely. A deliberate weaponized stillness that changes how people perceive you the second you walk into a room. Silence used with intention is one of the most misunderstood forms of power in existence because on the surface it looks like passivity. It looks like weakness. It looks like someone who has nothing to contribute. But underneath real silence, the kind we're going to dissect piece by piece in this video, is control. It is the discipline to withhold, the confidence to not need validation, and the presence to let your stillness do the talking your mouth never has to. Over the next 15 chapters, you're going to learn why the loudest person in the room is almost never the most respected one. You're going to learn the psychological mechanics behind why silence unsettles people, why it makes them fill in the blanks with their own insecurities, and why the less you explain yourself, the more powerful you become. You'll learn how silence functions as a weapon in negotiation, in conflict, in leadership, and in first impressions. You'll learn how to sit in a pause without flinching, how to let a question hang in the air until the other person breaks it, and how to build a presence so calm and so contained that people feel compelled to lean in just to understand you. By the end of this, you will not see conversation the same way again. You will start noticing every place where you used to fill silence out of anxiety. And you will start recognizing those same gaps as opportunities. This is the art that separates people who are merely liked from people who are truly respected. Let's begin. Chapter 1. The silence that speaks louder than words. Picture two people walking into the exact same room. The first person enters talking. They greet everyone loudly, crack a joke before they've even taken their coat off, and start narrating their own arrival as if the room needs a play-by-play. The second person walks in and says nothing at first. They take a breath, scan the room, make eye contact with a few people, and only speak once they have something worth saying. Ask yourself honestly, which one do you remember more? Which one do you respect more? Which one, if you had to guess, is more likely to be in charge? Almost universally people gravitate toward the second example, and yet almost nobody trains themselves to become that person. We are taught from childhood that communication means talking. We are rewarded in school for raising our hands, praised in meetings for having something to add, and told throughout our careers that if we want to be seen, we have to speak up. Nobody teaches us that there is an entire dimension of communication happening in the space where words are absent. And that dimension is often more persuasive than anything we could say out loud. Silence speaks because it forces interpretation. When you say something, you hand the listener a fixed meaning. They receive your words, process them, and respond to what you actually said. But when you say nothing, you hand them a blank space. And human beings cannot tolerate blank spaces. Our minds are pattern-completing machines. We see two dots in a line and we see a face. We hear an unfinished melody and our brain aches to complete it. So when you sit in silence during a conversation, especially a charged one, the other person's mind rushes in to fill that void with meaning of its own making. They project confidence onto you, wondering what you're thinking. They project judgment, wondering if you disapprove. They project intelligence, assuming your silence means you're processing something deeper than they are. In nearly every case, whatever they imagine is more powerful than anything you could have said aloud because their own mind built it. And we trust our own conclusions more than anyone else's words. This is the first and most fundamental truth about the power of silence. It is not an absence. It is a canvas, and the people around you are the ones painting on it. Usually in your favor as long as you hold the frame steady and don't rush to fill it yourself. Think about the most respected figures you've encountered in your own life. Whether a boss, a mentor, a parent, or a stranger who commanded a room without ever raising their voice, chances are they were not the ones talking the most. They were the ones who spoke only when it mattered and whose silence in between carried its own unmistakable weight. There is also a biological layer to this. When someone talks constantly, our nervous system treats it almost like background noise. The brain habituates to a steady stream of stimulus, meaning the more someone speaks, the less impact each individual word carries. But when a person is mostly silent and then speaks, that moment stands out. It breaks the pattern. It captures attention precisely because it is rare. This is why the person who talks the least in a meeting is often the one everyone turns to when they finally do speak. Their words haven't been diluted by overuse. Every sentence lands with the full weight of scarcity behind it. Consider also how silence interacts with status. In almost every animal hierarchy, and in nearly every human one too, the individual who does not need to perform for attention is read as higher status than the one who does. Insecurity has a sound. It sounds like overexplaining. It sounds like nervous laughter. It sounds like filling every pause with a joke to keep the mood from turning uncomfortable. Confidence, on the other hand, has almost no sound at all. It is comfortable existing in the room without narrating its own presence. The less you feel the need to prove yourself through constant speech, the more the room assumes you already have nothing to prove. None of this means you should walk around mute, refusing to engage or intentionally freezing people out. That's not power. That's just awkwardness dressed up as mystery. And people see through it quickly. What we're talking about is precision. It's choosing your words the way a surgeon chooses an incision. Deliberate, minimal, and exactly where it needs to be. It's understanding that every sentence you don't need to say is a sentence that left unsaid adds to your presence instead of subtracting from it. Think about the way scarcity affects value in almost every other domain of life. A resource that is abundant, freely available, and constantly offered loses its perceived worth almost immediately. No matter how genuinely valuable it is, a resource that is rare, carefully rationed, and only given under the right circumstances is instinctively treated as more precious, even if its actual content is identical. Words work exactly the same way. A person who talks constantly is in effect flooding the market with their own opinions, reactions, and commentary. And the market responds the way it always does to oversupply. It stops paying attention. A person who speaks rarely but precisely is operating from scarcity. And scarcity commands attention almost automatically. This is not a trick or a manipulation tactic. It is simply an accurate description of how human attention allocates itself, and understanding it changes the way you approach every conversation you have from this point forward. There's also a deeper layer worth sitting with here, which is that silence often reveals more about someone's actual confidence than their words ever could. Words can be rehearsed. Words can be performed. You can memorize a script, deliver a perfect pitch, and say all the right things while internally feeling like you're falling apart. But silence is much harder to fake convincingly. When you are genuinely at ease, your silence feels settled, unhurried, and comfortable. When you are anxious underneath a confident-sounding script, your silence tends to feel jagged, restless, and eager to end. People pick up on this distinction far more often than we give them credit for, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what tipped them off. This is why some people can say all the right words and still come across as somehow unconvincing, while others can say very little and still leave a room feeling like they just witnessed something powerful. From this chapter forward, I want you to start paying attention to your own default reaction to silence. Do you feel the urge to feel it? Do you rush to explain yourself the moment there's a pause? That urge is the very thing we are going to dismantle piece by piece until silence stops being something you fear and starts being something you wield. Chapter 2. Why weak people fear the pause. There is a particular kind of discomfort that creeps in the moment a conversation goes quiet. You felt it. Someone asks a question. There's a beat of silence while you think and your chest tightens slightly because the pause feels like it's stretching too long. Somebody has to say something. And if it's not going to be them, it feels like it has to be you. This reflex, the compulsion to rescue silence the instant it appears, is one of the most common and most damaging habits keeping people from ever being taken seriously. Weak communicators fear the pause because on some subconscious level they associate silence with judgment. If nobody is talking, they assume something is wrong. Maybe they said something stupid. Maybe the other person is bored. Maybe the silence means disapproval or worse, indifference. So they rush to fix it, throwing out an extra sentence, a nervous laugh, an unnecessary clarification nobody asked for. And in doing so, they hand away every ounce of power the silence could have given them. Instead of letting the other person sit with a question, a decision, or a statement, they undercut their own point by immediately diluting it with more words. Have you ever watched someone make a genuinely strong statement only to immediately soften it with a nervous qualifier? I think we should go with option 2. But I mean, whatever you guys think is fine, too. I'm not really sure. That single trailing sentence erases the strength of everything that came before it. The silence that should have followed the first sentence. The pause that would have let the statement breathe and land gets swallowed by anxious backpedaling. This fear of the pause is not really a fear of silence itself. It's a fear of being perceived as anything less than agreeable, likable, and safe. People who struggle with this have usually spent years learning that keeping others comfortable is their responsibility. They were praised as children for being easygoing, for smoothing over tension, for never letting a room sit in awkwardness for too long. But what feels like kindness in the moment becomes a permanent tell in adulthood. Every time you rush to fill a silence, you are broadcasting, sometimes without realizing it, that you cannot tolerate discomfort, that you need the room's approval more than the room needs yours. Compare that to someone who has trained themselves to sit inside a pause without flinching. Ask them a difficult question and they don't answer immediately. They take a breath. They actually think and then they respond deliberately. Once they have something worth saying, that single pause, uncomfortable as it might feel to the people around them, does more to establish their credibility than an instant polished answer ever could. It communicates that they are not performing for approval. It communicates that their words are considered not reactive, and crucially it forces the other person to wait, which is itself a subtle but undeniable transfer of control. The one who can tolerate the silence longer is in almost every interaction the one who holds more power in that exchange. There's a reason interrogators, negotiators, and skilled therapists are trained extensively in the use of the pause. They understand that most people cannot handle prolonged silence, and that if you simply wait without prompting, without rescuing the moment, the other person will almost always speak first, often revealing more than they intended. This isn't manipulation in a sinister sense. It's simply an acknowledgement of human psychology. Discomfort with silence runs so deep that most people will say almost anything to end it, including admissions, concessions, and honest answers they would have otherwise guarded closely. If you want to build this skill in yourself, start small. In your next few conversations, when you feel that itch to fill a pause, count to 3 in your head before responding. It will feel like an eternity the first few times. It isn't. Nobody else is counting. What you'll notice if you push through the discomfort is that the world does not collapse when a conversation goes quiet for a few seconds. Nobody thinks less of you. If anything, the opposite happens. People start to read your composure as strength, your restraint as intelligence, and your willingness to let silence exist as evidence that you are not desperate for their reassurance. That shift, small as it seems, is the beginning of an entirely different relationship with every room you walk into. It's worth acknowledging why this is so hard to unlearn even once you understand it intellectually. For most people, the fear of the pause was installed long before adulthood. In childhood, silence from a parent often meant disappointment. A quiet classroom often meant a teacher was about to call on you unprepared. A pause in a friendship conversation often meant the beginning of an awkward goodbye. We absorbed over years of repetition a subconscious equation that silence equals danger and danger must be resolved immediately. Undoing that equation isn't just a communication skill. It's closer to a nervous system retraining process, which is exactly why it takes deliberate repeated practice rather than a single insight to actually change. One useful reframe is to stop thinking of silence as something you are inflicting on the other person and start thinking of it as something you are simply allowing to exist. You are not doing anything to them by pausing. You are not being rude, cold or difficult. You are giving both of you a moment to actually think, which if anything is a form of respect rather than a withholding of it. Conversations rushed through at maximum speed rarely produce anyone's best thinking. They produce reflexive half-formed responses shaped more by social anxiety than genuine reflection. When you allow a pause to exist without apologizing for it, without rushing to explain why you're quiet, you are modeling a different, calmer rhythm of conversation. And more often than you'd expect, the other person unconsciously begins to match that rhythm rather than resist it. Silence, used this way, doesn't just protect your own composure. It gradually reshapes the entire tone of the exchange around you. It's also worth noticing how differently this plays out depending on who holds more perceived status in a given interaction. Watch any room with a clear hierarchy, a team meeting, a family dinner, a negotiation between unequal parties, and you'll notice that the person with the least to prove is almost always the one most comfortable letting a silence stretch. The people with something to prove, whether it's a junior employee trying to impress a boss or someone trying to win approval from a group, are the ones who rush to fill every gap, terrified that stillness will be read as incompetence. This means counterintuitively that practicing comfort with pauses doesn't just reflect existing status, it can actually help create it. When you deliberately choose not to rush, even in situations where you technically hold less formal power, you begin to signal a kind of internal authority that has nothing to do with title or position. And people respond to that signal whether or not they can name what they're responding to. Chapter 3: The Psychology of Unshakable Presence. There is a specific quality some people carry that is difficult to name but instantly recognizable. You feel it the moment they walk into a space. The room doesn't necessarily go quiet, but something shifts. People become slightly more aware of themselves. Conversations that were loose and sprawling tighten up a little. This quality is often mistaken for charisma, but it isn't the same thing. Charisma is about output, warmth, energy, magnetism that draws people toward you. What we're describing here is something quieter and in many ways more powerful. It's called presence, and it is built almost entirely on the foundation of restraint. Presence is not about being the most animated person in the room. It's about being the most contained. Think of it like the difference between a river rushing violently over rocks and a deep, still lake. The river is loud, dramatic, impossible to ignore in the moment, but it's shallow and its energy dissipates quickly. The lake is silent, but you sense its depth just by looking at it. You don't need it to announce how deep it is. The stillness itself communicates the depth. People with unshakable presence operate like that lake. They don't need to perform depth, urgency or importance because their composure already signals it. The psychological root of this comes down to nervous system regulation. When someone is anxious, their body reveals it in 100 subtle ways. Fidgeting hands, darting eyes, a voice that rises in pitch under pressure, a tendency to fill every silence with chatter because stillness feels unbearable to a dysregulated nervous system. We read these signals instinctively, often without consciously noticing them, and we interpret them as a lack of safety or control. On the other hand, someone who has trained their nervous system to remain calm under pressure, whose breathing stays even, whose movements stay deliberate, whose silences stay comfortable, is read as safe, stable, and crucially in control. And people are drawn to control. We are wired evolutionarily to seek out individuals who project stability in moments of uncertainty. Because throughout human history, those individuals were the ones capable of leading groups through danger. This is why unshakable presence cannot be faked through posturing alone. You cannot simply decide to stand up straighter and expect the effect to be convincing if your internal state is still chaotic. Presence has to be built from the inside out. It requires training yourself to tolerate discomfort without immediately reacting to it. It requires learning to sit with an awkward silence, an aggressive question, or an uncomfortable stare without flinching, blinking rapidly, or rushing to smooth things over. Every time you successfully tolerate one of these moments without collapsing into anxious behavior, you are quite literally rewiring your nervous system to associate social pressure with calm rather than panic. Over time, this becomes your default state, not a performance you have to consciously maintain. One of the most overlooked components of presence is the pace at which someone moves and speaks. Anxious people move quickly. They walk fast, talk fast, and react instantly. Presence, on the other hand, is slow by design. Not because slowness is inherently better, but because unhurried movement signals that you are not being controlled by urgency or fear. When you speak more slowly than feels natural at first, when you allow a beat before answering, when you move through a room without rushing, you are communicating on a level most people can't consciously articulate. That nothing about this moment threatens your sense of control. This single shift, slowing down deliberately, is one of the fastest ways to begin building the kind of presence that makes people take you seriously before you've said a single word. Presence is also deeply tied to eye contact, though not in the way most people think. It's not about staring someone down. It's about not looking away the instant things get uncomfortable. Most people break eye contact the moment a conversation turns tense because their instinct is to escape the discomfort. Someone with real presence holds that contact a beat longer, not aggressively but calmly, communicating without a single word that they are not rattled. This alone, practiced consistently, will change how people respond to you in nearly every interaction, from casual conversations to high-stakes negotiations. Build this over time, not overnight. Start by noticing your own pace. Notice when you speed up out of nervousness. Notice when you look away too quickly. Notice when your voice rises under pressure. Awareness is always the first step because you cannot regulate what you refuse to observe in yourself. Once you begin catching these patterns in real time, you can start deliberately choosing the opposite response, slowing your pace, holding your gaze a moment longer, letting your voice stay level. Each small correction compounds, and eventually the presence you were once forcing becomes simply who you are. It also helps to understand that presence is not a fixed trait. Some people are simply born with and others are permanently excluded from. It is closer to a skill built through repeated exposure to discomfort. The same way physical strength is built through repeated exposure to resistance. Every time you choose to stay steady instead of reactive, you are in a very real sense doing a representative early on. These reps feel forced, almost artificial, like you're performing calm rather than genuinely feeling it. That's normal, and it's not a sign you're doing it wrong. Almost every skill feels artificial before it becomes automatic. A person learning to drive a manual transmission for the first time is hyper-aware of every clutch movement, every gear shift, every deliberate calculation. An experienced driver does the same actions without a single conscious thought. Presence follows the same arc. The calm you forced today becomes the calm you simply have in a year, provided you keep doing the reps instead of abandoning the practice the first time it feels unnatural. There's one more dimension worth naming here, which is the relationship between presence and silence in physical space, not just conversational space. How someone occupies a room physically, whether they take up space confidently or shrink themselves defensively, whether they move with unhurried purpose or scurry from point to point, communicates almost as much as their words do. A person with real presence doesn't rush to greet everyone the moment they enter a room. They don't need to prove their arrival matters. They let the room notice them rather than working to be noticed. And paradoxically, this restraint is exactly what makes people notice them more. Chapter 4. Silence is a weapon in conflict. Conflict has a gravitational pull toward noise. Voices rise. Words come faster. People interrupt, talk over each other, and rush to defend themselves before the other person has even finished their sentence. This is instinctive, rooted in the same fight-or-flight wiring that once kept our ancestors alive in physical confrontations. But in modern conflict, whether it's an argument with a partner, a tense negotiation, or a heated disagreement at work, the person who escalates the noise is almost always the one who ends up losing ground, while the person who introduces silence into the chaos often walks away with the upper hand. Here's why. When two people are arguing loudly, both are operating from the emotional reactive parts of their brain, neither is thinking clearly. Neither is actually listening. Both are simply waiting for their turn to speak, rehearsing their next point instead of absorbing what's being said to them. In this state, nothing productive happens because nobody is actually processing information. They're just discharging emotional energy at each other. But the moment one person stops matching that energy, the moment they go quiet instead of escalating, something remarkable happens to the dynamic. The silence acts like a mirror, forcing the other person to hear how loud, reactive, or unreasonable they sound. In contrast, very few people can maintain full aggressive momentum against someone who refuses to engage at that same pitch. The silence essentially removes their target. This doesn't mean going silent is a form of punishment. The cold sulking withdrawal some people use to manipulate a partner into chasing their approval. That's a different behavior entirely rooted in control through withholding affection. And it tends to erode trust rather than build respect. What we're talking about here is a composed, deliberate stillness in the middle of tension. A refusal to be pulled into someone else's emotional chaos. It looks like staying quiet for a moment after someone raises their voice at you rather than immediately raising yours in response. It looks like letting an accusation hang in the air unanswered rather than scrambling to defend yourself the instant it's spoken. That gap, uncomfortable as it feels, often does more work than any rebuttal could because it denies the other person the reaction they were fishing for and forces them to sit with their own words. There is also a strategic dimension to using silence during conflict, particularly in negotiations or disputes where information matters. When you respond to every provocation immediately, you reveal your position instantly. The other person learns exactly what upsets you, what you're willing to concede, and how far they can push before you react. But if you pause before responding, even briefly, you give yourself the chance to choose your response deliberately rather than reactively. You stop handing the other party a live feed into your emotional state, and instead you force them to wonder what you're thinking, which puts them in the position of uncertainty rather than you. Silence during conflict also has a disarming effect on manipulation. People who use guilt, provocation, or aggressive tactics to control a conversation are counting on an emotional reaction. They want you defensive, rattled, talking quickly to justify yourself. When you refuse to give them that, when you simply let a manipulative statement sit in silence for a beat too long before responding calmly, it often unsettles the manipulator far more than a heated counterargument would. Manipulation thrives on reaction. Silence starves it. Learning to use silence in conflict takes practice because our instinct in tense moments is almost always to speak faster, not slower. Start by training yourself to take one full breath before responding to anything that raises your heart rate. Whether it's a criticism, an accusation, or a provocation, that single breath interrupts the reflexive response loop and gives you a sliver of space to choose your next move deliberately over time. That sliver of space becomes your greatest advantage in any confrontation because while the other person is reacting, you're the only one in the room actually thinking. It also helps to recognize the specific moment where most people lose control of a conflict, which is not the first provocation, but the second one. Most people can hold their composure through one aggressive comment. It's the follow-up, the second jab, the escalation designed to finally break through your calm that tends to land. This is precisely where silence matters most. If you can let the second provocation pass without matching its energy, you have effectively demonstrated that there is no amount of pushing that will pull you off balance. And that realization alone tends to end most conflicts faster than any argument could. People push because they expect a reaction. When the reaction never comes, the pushing eventually loses its purpose. There's also something to be said for the aftermath of a conflict handled with silence rather than escalation. Arguments won through volume tend to leave residue. Resentment, embarrassment, a lingering sense that things got out of hand. Arguments diffused through calm restraint tend to leave both people, even the one who was in the wrong, with more respect for how the situation was handled. This matters more than it might seem in the moment because how you handle conflict becomes part of your reputation over time. People remember not just what was said in a disagreement, but how someone carried themselves through it. Being known as the person who doesn't get rattled, who doesn't need to win loudly, who can hold a boundary without raising their voice is a reputation that compounds in your favor far beyond any single argument. Chapter 5. The Art of Strategic Restraint. If silence is the tool, restraint is the discipline that makes the tool usable. Anyone can technically stay quiet for a few seconds. Far fewer people can hold back the urge to explain themselves, justify a decision, correct a misunderstanding, or fill an uncomfortable gap. Even when every instinct is screaming at them to do so. This is the art of strategic restraint, and it is without question one of the rarest and most respected qualities a person can develop. Most people operate under the false belief that more explanation equals more credibility. If someone questions a decision you made, the instinct is to immediately justify it. To lay out every reason, every piece of context, every consideration that led you there. It feels responsible, it feels thorough, but in practice, over-explaining almost always weakens your position. Rather than strengthening it, every additional sentence you offer beyond what's necessary signals subtly but unmistakably that you don't fully trust your first answer to stand on its own. It reads as insecurity dressed up as diligence. The person who states their decision once clearly and then stops without chasing it with 3 paragraphs of justification comes across as far more confident even if their reasoning is identical to the person who over-explained. This is a difficult shift for most people because we are taught, especially in professional environments, that transparency and thoroughness are virtues, and to a point they are. But there is a meaningful difference between being transparent when asked and volunteering excessive justification nobody requested. Strategic restraint means answering the question you were actually asked at the length it actually requires and then stopping. If someone wants more detail, they will ask for it. And at that point, you can provide it deliberately rather than dumping it preemptively out of anxiety that your first answer wasn't sufficient. Restraint also applies powerfully to the urge to correct every misunderstanding. Not every misreading of you needs to be fixed immediately. If someone draws an incorrect conclusion about something minor, the reflexive urge is to jump in and clarify right away, protecting your image in that exact moment. But constantly correcting every small misunderstanding, chasing every misperception actually erodes your presence over time because it signals that you are highly reactive to how you're perceived. That you cannot tolerate even minor inaccuracies about yourself existing in someone else's mind for more than a few seconds. People with real restraint let small misunderstandings pass. They trust that their actions and their pattern of behavior over time will clarify who they are far more effectively than a rushed defensive correction ever could. There is a particular kind of power in the phrase "I don't need to explain that." Used sparingly and only when appropriate, but understood internally as a governing principle even when it's never said aloud. It means not every question deserves a full answer. Not every criticism deserves a rebuttal. Not every silence needs to be broken by you specifically. This doesn't mean becoming evasive, cold, or unreasonably secretive. That would just create a different kind of weakness. This time rooted in avoidance rather than confidence. It means developing the judgment to know the difference between a moment that genuinely calls for explanation and a moment where explanation is simply an anxious reflex. Strategic restraint extends to withholding reactions as well as words. When something surprises you, upsets you, or excites you, the instinct is to display that reaction immediately and visibly. People with restraint train themselves to absorb the reaction internally first, to let their face and body stay composed for a beat before deciding how or whether to express anything outwardly. This isn't about suppressing emotion entirely or becoming robotic. It's about controlling the timing of your expression rather than letting your expression control you. A person who can receive shocking news, an insult, or an unexpected compliment without their face immediately broadcasting every internal shift, is a person whose reactions when they finally do show carry far more weight because they're rare and deliberate rather than constant and reflexive. Building this discipline starts with catching yourself in the smallest moments. The next time you feel the urge to explain a decision nobody questioned, pause and ask yourself if that explanation is actually necessary or if it's simply anxiety asking to be soothed. The next time someone misunderstands something minor about you, practice letting it go instead of correcting it. The next time you feel a strong reaction rising, give yourself 1 extra second before you let it show on your face. None of these moments feel significant in isolation, but stacked together day after day, they become the architecture of a person who is read correctly. As someone who does not need to perform control because they actually have it. There's a particular test worth applying whenever you feel the urge to add more words to something you've already said. Ask yourself a simple question. Is this additional sentence giving new information or is it simply seeking reassurance that the first sentence was received? Well, most unnecessary talking falls into the second category. We keep talking not because the listener needs more information, but because we haven't yet gotten the reaction we were quietly hoping for. Whether that's agreement, approval, or simply a signal that we're still liked. Recognizing this pattern in yourself is uncomfortable because it means acknowledging how much of our speech is driven by a need for reassurance rather than genuine communication. But that recognition is also liberating because once you see it clearly, you can start choosing differently. You can let a statement stand on its own. Resist the urge to check whether it landed well and trust that your worth in the room does not depend on constant confirmation. Restraint ultimately is not about becoming less expressive or less genuine. It's about becoming more intentional. The goal is never to hide who you are behind a wall of calculated silence. The goal is to stop leaking your uncertainty into every interaction through compulsive words. So that when you do choose to express something, whether an opinion, a reaction, or an explanation, it actually means something because it was chosen rather than reflexively spilled. This is the thread that connects every chapter so far. Silence is not the absence of communication. It is communication distilled down to only what matters. Stripped of the anxious filler that dilutes almost everyone else's words. And as you're about to see in the chapters ahead, this same principle extends far beyond individual conversations, shaping how you're perceived in negotiations, in leadership, in first impressions, and in every room you will ever walk into for the rest of your life. Chapter 6. Silence in Negotiation. The Unspoken Advantage. Every negotiation, whether it's a salary discussion, a business deal, or something as ordinary as haggling over a price, follows an invisible current beneath the surface conversation. Both sides are trying to gather information about the other's limits while revealing as little as possible about their own. And in this hidden game, silence is one of the sharpest tools available precisely because almost nobody uses it deliberately. Most people walk into a negotiation focused entirely on what they're going to say, rehearsing their pitch, their counterarguments, their justifications. Almost nobody rehearses what they're going to withhold. And that oversight is exactly where the advantage lives. Consider the simplest version of this dynamic. You make an offer, whether it's a number, a proposal, or a request, and then you stop talking completely. No follow-up sentence explaining why the number is fair. No nervous addition softening the ask. Just the offer followed by silence. For most people, this is almost physically uncomfortable to execute because the silence that follows feels like it's begging to be filled. And the fear is that if you don't fill it, the whole thing will fall apart. But this discomfort is exactly the mechanism that makes the tactic work. The other party sitting across from your silence experiences the exact same discomfort you're resisting. And in the vast majority of cases, they are the ones who break it first, often by negotiating against themselves. They'll fill the gap with a justification, a counter-offer, or sometimes an outright concession simply because the silence became unbearable and they needed to be the one to end it. This works because silence during a request functions as an implicit statement of conviction. When you make an offer and immediately start explaining or justifying it, you signal, even unintentionally, that you're not entirely sure it will be accepted as is. You're pre-negotiating with yourself before the other party has even responded. But when you state your position and then simply wait calmly without needing to prop it up with extra words, you signal that the number or the terms are not up for immediate debate, that you're comfortable letting them sit with the offer exactly as it was presented. This single behavioral shift, saying less and waiting longer, has been shown repeatedly in real negotiations to produce better outcomes than any clever line of persuasive language could achieve on its own. Silence also plays a critical role after the other party speaks. When someone gives you their counter-offer, their objection, or their pushback, the instinct is to respond immediately, often defensively. But the more valuable move is often to pause, visibly consider what they said, and let a beat of silence pass before responding. This does two things simultaneously. First, it prevents you from reacting emotionally to a number or a statement that might have been designed specifically to provoke a reaction. Second, it signals that you are taking their position seriously enough to actually think about it rather than dismissing it reflexively. Ironically, this often earns you more credibility in the room than an instant, confident-sounding rebuttal would, because instant responses can read as rehearsed or dismissive, while a considered pause reads as thoughtful engagement. There's also a specific and often overlooked application of silence that comes after asking a direct, uncomfortable question in a negotiation. Something like, "Is this truly your final offer?" Many people ask a question like this and then immediately keep talking, softening it, adding context, essentially rescuing the other person from having to answer directly. The moment you ask a pointed question like that, your job is to stop talking entirely and let the question exist in the air, uncushioned. It will feel excruciating. It works precisely because it's excruciating for both people, and the other party uncomfortable with the tension will often answer far more honestly than they would have if you'd given them an easy out. None of this requires being cold, aggressive, or manipulative in tone. In fact, the most effective use of silence in negotiation is almost always paired with warmth in delivery, a calm tone, a relaxed posture, genuine eye contact. The silence isn't a weapon wielded with hostility. It's simply the space you create by trusting your position enough not to overexplain it. Practice this the next time you're negotiating anything, even something small like a return at a store or a scheduling conflict with a coworker. State your position clearly once and then let it sit. You'll be surprised how often the other side moves first simply because you gave the silence room to do the work that words alone never could. It's also worth understanding why this tactic is so rarely used despite how effective it consistently proves to be. Most negotiation advice focuses almost entirely on what to say, the perfect opening line, the ideal counterargument, the right framing for a request. Very little attention is given to the discipline of stopping because stopping doesn't feel like doing anything. It feels passive, even risky, as though by not speaking, you're somehow losing ground or appearing unprepared. This misconception keeps most people talking past the point where their position was already strong, undercutting themselves with unnecessary additions the moment discomfort creeps in. The people who master negotiation are rarely the most articulate talkers in the room. They are the ones who understand that the negotiation is often won or lost, not in what they say, but in what they resist the urge to add once they've already said enough. There's a particular scenario worth preparing for specifically. The moment right after you've delivered a number or a term that you know the other party won't love hearing. This is precisely when the anxious instinct to soften the blow with extra words is strongest, and precisely when resisting that instinct pays off the most. Whatever discomfort you feel in that silence, remember that the other person is feeling it too. And in most cases, they are far less equipped to tolerate it than you are. Especially once you've practiced this skill deliberately across multiple interactions. The first few times you try this, it will feel unnatural, even a little frightening. That discomfort fades quickly once you start noticing how often the silence works in your favor and how rarely, if ever, anything goes wrong simply because you chose to stop talking a few seconds sooner than felt comfortable. It's also useful to prepare mentally before any negotiation by deciding in advance exactly where your silences will go. Most people plan their talking points meticulously but never plan their pauses. Which means when the actual moment arrives, the anxious instinct takes over by default because nothing else has been rehearsed. Before an important conversation, try identifying the one or two key statements you intend to make and commit as part of your preparation to saying nothing further. Once each of those statements has landed, treat the silence itself as part of the script, not an accidental gap you're hoping to survive, but a deliberate beat you're choosing to hold. This reframing alone makes an enormous difference in how naturally you're able to execute it when the real conversation actually begins. Because you've already given yourself permission in advance to let the quiet exist without panicking through it. Chapter 7. The Mystery Effect. Why withholding creates intrigue. There's a specific kind of person who lingers in your memory long after a single conversation. Someone you find yourself thinking about days later, wondering what they actually meant by that one comment, curious about the parts of their life they never mentioned. This isn't accidental. It's the result of a psychological principle so consistent it shows up across storytelling, branding, relationships, and social dynamics alike. Incompleteness creates fascination in a way that completeness never can. A story fully told the moment it begins loses its pull immediately. A person who reveals everything about themselves within the first conversation becomes almost paradoxically less interesting the more they share because there's nothing left for the listener's imagination to do. This is the mechanism behind what we'll call the mystery effect. And it operates almost entirely through what is withheld rather than what is said. When someone shares a detail about themselves but doesn't elaborate further. When they reference something significant in their past without explaining it fully. When they answer a personal question honestly but briefly. Rather than turning it into a lengthy story, the listener's mind does something remarkable. It doesn't lose interest. It leans in. Our brains are drawn instinctively toward incomplete information the same way they're drawn toward an unfinished sentence or an unresolved chord in music. We want resolution, and the person who doesn't immediately hand us that resolution becomes in our minds someone worth paying closer attention to. Compare this to the far more common pattern of oversharing where someone answers even a simple question with an exhaustive unprompted life history. On the surface it might seem like this builds connection through transparency, and to some degree in the right context it can. But used as a default mode of communication, oversharing tends to have the opposite effect of what people intend. It removes all sense of depth because everything has already been placed on the table. There's no more curiosity left to generate, no more layers left to discover. And interest, which thrives on gradual discovery, simply has nothing left to work with. People who overshare are often deeply likable in the moment, but rarely remain intriguing over time because they've already given away the entire experience of getting to know them in a single sitting. The mystery effect isn't about deception or deliberately hiding who you are to seem more impressive than you actually are. It's about pacing your self-disclosure. The way a well-told story paces its reveals, giving enough to keep someone engaged, but never so much that there's nothing left to wonder about. This applies just as much in professional contexts as personal ones. A leader who explains every single decision in exhaustive detail, who justifies every internal thought process out loud, becomes fully transparent but also fully predictable, and predictability, while comfortable, rarely commands the kind of respect that comes from a person whose reasoning process retains some element of the unknown. There's a related principle worth understanding here, which is that people tend to fill in gaps about others with more impressive interpretations than the truth often warrants. If you mention briefly that you spent a few years working on something difficult without elaborating on every detail of the struggle, most people's minds will imagine something more significant, more challenging, or more impressive than if you had simply narrated the entire ordeal step by step. This isn't about lying or exaggerating. It's about recognizing that human imagination, when given a little room to operate, tends to construct a more compelling version of you than an exhaustive account ever could on its own. Practicing this doesn't mean becoming evasive or refusing to answer questions people genuinely ask. It means resisting the reflex to volunteer more than what's being asked and getting comfortable letting a brief, honest answer stand on its own without padding it out. The next time someone asks you about something meaningful in your life, try answering with fewer words than feels natural, and then simply stop talking. Notice how often the other person leans forward, asks a follow-up question, becomes more engaged rather than less. That reaction is the mystery effect in real time, and it's available to you in nearly every conversation you'll ever have. The moment you stop feeling obligated to explain everything all at once. This principle also explains why some of the most respected and admired figures throughout history and across cultures have shared a common trait: a certain reluctance to explain themselves fully, even when explanation would have been easy to offer. Their silence on certain matters wasn't necessarily strategic in a calculated sense. Often it simply reflected an internal comfort with not needing external validation for every choice or belief they held. But the effect on the people around them was the same. Regardless of the underlying motivation, their restraint created a kind of gravitational pull. An unspoken invitation for others to wonder, to speculate, to remain curious rather than satisfied. Wherever curiosity remains unresolved, attention remains engaged. The moment curiosity is fully resolved, attention naturally moves elsewhere, searching for the next incomplete story to follow. It's worth applying this same principle to how you talk about your own accomplishments and setbacks. Someone who recounts a difficult period of their life in exhaustive blow-by-blow detail, explaining every emotion and every turn of events, often generates sympathy in the moment, but rarely lasting intrigue. Someone who mentions briefly that a certain period was difficult without elaborating further and less specifically asked tends to generate a very different reaction. Quiet respect paired with genuine curiosity about what exactly that difficulty entailed. The withheld detail becomes in the listener's mind evidence of depth rather than evasion. Provided your overall demeanor remains warm and open rather than guarded or cold. The goal is never to seem mysterious for its own sake, but to recognize that restraint in storytelling, just like restraint in ordinary conversation, tends to leave a more lasting and more respected impression than full disclosure ever could. This same dynamic shows up clearly in how people respond to compliments as well. Someone who receives a compliment and immediately deflects it with a long self-deprecating explanation, downplaying the achievement, listing every person who helped, minimizing their own role in exhaustive detail, tends to dilute the moment entirely. Someone who receives a compliment with a simple genuine acknowledgement, a brief thank you, perhaps a short sentence of context if it feels natural, and then allows the moment to pass without over-explaining, retains far more of the compliment's original power. The silence after the compliment, rather than a nervous rush to minimize it, lets the achievement actually register in the room, both for the person who gave the compliment and for anyone else listening. This applies to nearly every form of positive attention you receive throughout life. And learning to sit comfortably in a moment of recognition without immediately talking your way out of it is its own quiet form of the same mastery this entire chapter has been describing. Chapter 8. Silence and Leadership. Commanding without demanding. Walk into any organization and you'll notice a pattern almost immediately. The managers who talk the most in meetings are rarely the ones the team respects the most. Often it's the opposite. There's usually one person in the room. Sometimes not even the highest ranking one, who says relatively little. But when they do speak, the entire room adjusts its posture slightly and listens more carefully. This is not a coincidence. It's the direct result of a principle that separates true leadership from mere authority. The ability to command a room without needing to dominate its airtime. Poor leadership often masquerades as decisiveness through constant talking. A leader who feels the need to comment on everything, to have the final word in every discussion, to fill every silence in a meeting with their own input, is often mistaking volume for authority. But real authority doesn't need to announce itself constantly. It's demonstrated through restraint, through the discipline to let others speak first, to actually listen to what's being said rather than simply waiting for a gap to insert their own opinion, and to speak only once they have something that genuinely moves the conversation forward. There's a specific leadership technique built almost entirely around this principle, sometimes called strategic silence in meetings. Instead of immediately responding to a question or a problem raised by the team, an effective leader will often pause, sometimes for several seconds, before offering any input. This pause serves multiple purposes simultaneously. It signals that the leader is taking the input seriously rather than reacting reflexively. It creates space for other team members to fill the silence with their own ideas rather than the leader dominating the solution-finding process. And it prevents the leader's own initial reaction, which is not always their best thinking, from becoming the default answer simply because it was spoken first and loudest. This matters enormously for team dynamics, because when a leader speaks immediately and confidently on every topic, team members quickly learn that their own input is largely ceremonial, that the leader has already decided and is simply waiting for the room to agree. This creates a culture of passive compliance rather than genuine collaboration. But when a leader consistently demonstrates that they can sit with a question, let the team work through it, and only step in when their input genuinely adds value, team members begin contributing more freely, more creatively, and more honestly, because they trust that the space actually belongs to the discussion, not just to the leader's next sentence. Silence also functions as a powerful tool in moments of crisis or high pressure. Situations where a team is looking to a leader for cues on how to feel. If a leader panics visibly, reacts loudly, or fills every second with anxious commentary during a crisis, the entire team absorbs that anxiety and their own performance deteriorates. But a leader who can receive bad news, sit with it for a moment without an immediate emotional outburst, and then respond with calm, measured language, sets the emotional tone for everyone else in the room. This is not about suppressing genuine concern or pretending problems don't exist. It's about controlling the pace and tone of your response so that your team experiences stability during instability rather than chaos compounding chaos. There's a particular kind of respect that gets earned specifically through this pattern of behavior over time. A respect that has very little to do with title or formal authority and everything to do with demonstrated composure. Team members and colleagues begin to associate a leader's silence with thoughtfulness rather than absence, and their eventual words, precisely because they are chosen rather than constant, begin to carry disproportionate weight. If you find yourself in any position of leadership, whether formal or informal, whether managing a team of 50 or simply the person others naturally turn to for guidance, the fastest way to increase your influence is often not to speak more, but to speak less, and to make sure that every time you do, it's because the moment genuinely called for it. This principle extends into how leaders handle praise and credit as well. A leader who talks constantly about their own contributions, who narrates every success in detail, tends to generate quiet resentment among a team, even if the praise is technically deserved. A leader who stays relatively quiet about their own role, who allows the team's contributions to be highlighted first, and who only speaks about their own part when directly asked, tends to generate far deeper loyalty. This isn't about false modesty or refusing to acknowledge real accomplishments. It's about understanding that constantly narrating your own value tends to diminish how that value is perceived. while restraint around self-promotion tends to have the opposite effect, allowing your reputation to be built more powerfully through the observations of others than through your own account of yourself. There's also a specific application of this in how leaders deliver difficult feedback. The instinct for many people in leadership positions is to soften criticism with an overwhelming amount of surrounding context, padding a difficult message with so much explanation that the actual point gets lost in reassurance. A leader who has mastered the use of silence tends to deliver difficult feedback more directly, stating the issue clearly, then pausing, allowing the weight of the statement to actually register rather than immediately rushing to cushion it. This might feel less comfortable in the moment both for the leader and the person receiving the feedback, but it tends to produce far more genuine behavioral change than a message so heavily softened that its core point becomes easy to dismiss or forget entirely. This same restraint proves valuable in moments where a leader is asked a question they don't yet have the answer to. The anxious instinct is to fill that gap immediately, offering a half-formed guess simply to avoid the discomfort of admitting uncertainty in front of the team. But a leader who can calmly say after a brief pause that they need time to think it through properly before answering projects far more credibility than one who rushes out a shaky, unconsidered response just to fill the silence. Admitting you don't have an immediate answer delivered calmly and without anxious over-explanation is itself a demonstration of the same composed authority this entire chapter has been describing. It tells the team that your words, when you do offer them, are worth the wait because you'd rather take a moment of silence than hand them something half-considered simply to avoid an uncomfortable pause. Chapter 9. The First Impression. You never have to speak. Research on first impressions consistently points to an uncomfortable truth for anyone who relies primarily on their words to make an impact. Most people form a lasting judgment about someone within the first few seconds of meeting them, long before enough words have been exchanged to actually justify that judgment logically. What fills that gap? The space before words have had a chance to do their work. As almost entirely nonverbal, posture, eye contact, the pace of movement, facial composure, and yes, the presence or absence of nervous unnecessary talking. In other words, long before you say anything memorable, the room has already started forming an opinion of you based on your silence. This is why so many people undermine themselves in the opening moments of an interaction without realizing it. Walking into a room and immediately overgreeting everyone, laughing nervously before anything funny has actually happened. Launching into rapid unprompted small talk to fill the discomfort of a new introduction. All of these behaviors, while well-intentioned, signal anxiety before a single meaningful word has been exchanged. The other person's nervous system picks up on this instantly, often subconsciously, and files it away as information about your internal state, regardless of how polished your actual words turn out to be a few minutes later. Compare this to someone who walks into the same room and pauses, even briefly before speaking. Someone who makes eye contact, allows a beat of quiet acknowledgement, and only then offers a calm, unhurried greeting. This person has in the span of just a few seconds communicated an entirely different set of signals: composure, self-assurance, and a lack of desperate need for the room's immediate approval. Notice that neither person has said anything particularly clever or impressive yet. The entire difference in impression comes down to pacing and restraint. The presence or absence of anxious filler in those opening seconds. This principle extends into the handshake. A moment often overlooked but psychologically loaded. A rushed, overly enthusiastic handshake paired with immediate rapid speech signals eagerness bordering on desperation. A calm handshake held for a beat longer than feels automatic, paired with silence or a simple unhurried greeting signals the opposite. It's a small physical moment, but it sets the tone for everything that follows because the other person's brain has already started constructing a narrative about who you are before you've said a single substantive sentence. There's also the matter of what happens in the pause after you're introduced to someone, right before the conversation actually begins. Most people rush to fill this gap immediately with a question or a comment, terrified of even a 2-second silence after an introduction. but allowing that brief pause to exist. Simply holding the other person's gaze for a moment longer, taking them in rather than immediately performing conversation actually deepens the quality of the impression you leave. It signals that you're not on autopilot, reciting a script you use with everyone you meet, but genuinely present with this specific person in this specific moment. None of this suggests you should walk into every room stone-faced or deliberately withholding warmth. That would create the wrong impression entirely. Reading is coldness rather than composure. Warmth and restraint are not opposites. The most compelling first impressions combine genuine warmth, a real smile, real eye contact, real attentiveness with the absence of anxious filler-driven behavior. It's entirely possible to be warm and unhurried at the same time. And in fact, that combination is often what people describe without quite knowing how to articulate it as someone who simply has something. The moment they walk into a room, that something more often than not is nothing more than the discipline to let the first few seconds of silence exist rather than rushing to fill them the way almost everyone else instinctively does. This becomes especially important in situations where you're meeting someone whose opinion genuinely matters to you. A job interview, a first date, an introduction to someone whose respect you'd like to earn. In these higher stakes moments, the nervous pull toward overtalking becomes even stronger because the desire to be liked intensifies right alongside the anxiety. This is exactly the moment to remember that the calm, restrained version of yourself, the one who doesn't rush the opening seconds of an interaction, is almost always the more compelling version, even though every nervous instinct in your body is telling you to talk faster, explain more, and prove your worth immediately. The irony is that trying hardest to impress someone through rapid anxious speech tends to produce the opposite effect of what you're hoping for. While trusting the silence, trusting that you don't need to fill every second to be taken seriously, tends to produce exactly the impression you were chasing all along. It's also worth considering how this plays out over the course of an entire first meeting. Not just the opening seconds. People who pace their conversation with natural pauses, who don't feel compelled to have an instant response to everything, who allow moments of comfortable quiet to exist between exchanges, tend to be remembered as more substantial, more grounded, and more trustworthy than people who maintain constant unbroken chatter for the entire interaction. This is because comfortable silence during an ongoing conversation signals something different than awkward silence. It signals ease, a sense that neither person needs to be entertained every single second to feel the interaction is going well. Learning to distinguish between an awkward silence, one born of genuine discomfort, or a stalled conversation, and a comfortable silence, one that simply reflects two people who don't feel the need to perform constantly for each other, is a skill in itself. And it's one that dramatically changes how memorable and respected you become. In every first meeting from that point forward, there's one final piece worth naming, which is that first impressions built on restraint tend to age far better than first impressions built on performance. Someone who impresses a room through non-stop charm, energy, and rapid conversation often peaks in that very first interaction because there's nowhere left to go. The entire performance was already delivered up front. Someone who leaves a quieter, more composed first impression tends to grow in stature over subsequent interactions because each new conversation reveals a bit more rather than repeating the same high-energy display that defined the first meeting. If you've ever met someone who seemed only mildly interesting on first encounter, but grew steadily more impressive and more respected the longer you knew them, this is very often the mechanism at play. Their initial restraint wasn't a missed opportunity to impress you sooner. It was the deliberate pacing of an impression built to last far longer than a single conversation ever could. Chapter 10. Silence as Self-Respect. Setting Boundaries Without Words. There's a specific moment many people are familiar with being criticized, mocked, or disrespected in some way, and immediately feeling the pull to defend themselves, to explain, to argue back, to prove the accusation wrong. This reflex feels protective in the moment, like the only way to preserve your dignity is to actively fight for it in real time. But there is a different, often far more powerful response available in these situations, one built entirely on silence. And it tends to communicate self-respect more effectively than any defense ever could. When someone insults you, mocks you, or attempts to provoke a reaction, what they are often unconsciously seeking is engagement. They want to see that their words landed, that they got under your skin, that they successfully pulled you into a reactive state where you feel compelled to respond on their terms. The moment you respond immediately and defensively, even if your defense is factually correct, you have handed them exactly what they were looking for, proof that their words affected you. Silence in this context denies them that proof entirely. Not an aggressive cold silence meant to punish, but a calm, unaffected pause that communicates without a single word, that their comment simply didn't land the way they hoped it would. This is one of the most difficult applications of silence to actually practice because our instinct when disrespected is almost violently strong. The urge to correct the record immediately to make sure everyone in the room knows the accusation is unfair. But consider what happens when you don't. Consider the effect of receiving a rude comment, pausing for a moment, holding calm eye contact, and then simply continuing on with what you were doing or saying without acknowledging the jab at all. This response, more than almost any rebuttal could, signals an internal security that doesn't require external validation or correction. It says without saying anything that your sense of self isn't fragile enough to be shaken by a single comment from someone else. There is an important distinction here between silence as self-respect and silence as avoidance or people-pleasing. This is not about staying quiet because you're afraid of conflict or because you've been conditioned to swallow disrespect to keep the peace. Genuine boundary setting through silence comes from a place of calm strength, not fear. If a comment genuinely requires a direct response, a clear boundary, a firm correction, then silence is not the right tool, and using it as an excuse to avoid necessary confrontation would be a mislocation of everything discussed in this chapter. The silence we're describing here is a choice made from strength, reserved specifically for moments where a reaction would only feed the exact behavior you want to discourage. Not a default habit used to avoid every uncomfortable interaction. There's also a quieter, more everyday version of this same principle. The discipline of not explaining yourself to people who haven't earned the right to an explanation. Not every decision you make, every choice about your time, your relationships, or your priorities requires justification to everyone who happens to have an opinion about it. Many people exhaust themselves defending choices to people whose approval was never actually necessary in the first place. Learning to simply state a decision without an accompanying essay justifying it to someone who has no real stake in the outcome is itself a profound act of self-respect. It communicates both to yourself and to the people around you that your choices don't require a permission slip from everyone in your orbit. Over time, this pattern, staying calm and quiet in the face of disrespect, not over-explaining your decisions to people who haven't earned that access, becomes deeply protective of your own energy and self-image. You stop spending your emotional resources defending yourself against every minor jab or judgment. And you start reserving your words for the moments that genuinely deserve them. People notice this shift even if they can't fully articulate why. They begin treating you with more consideration. Not because you demanded it, but because your silence in the face of disrespect made it clear without a single confrontation that you simply were not available for that kind of treatment anymore. There's a broader truth underneath all of this worth sitting with as this chapter closes, which is that the way you handle small disrespects tends to teach people how to treat you going forward far more effectively than any explicit statement of your boundaries ever could. If your default response to being mocked, dismissed, or spoken to carelessly is immediate, visible, upset, people learn that you are an easy source of reaction. And some people, consciously or not, will keep testing that reaction simply because it's available to them. But if your default response is calm, unaffected silence, followed by a return to your own composure without a hint of lingering resentment, people learn something entirely different, that this particular approach doesn't work on you. And most people, once they learn that, simply stop trying. This doesn't mean you become numb or indifferent to genuine harm or that you tolerate patterns of disrespect indefinitely without ever addressing them directly. When a direct conversation is truly warranted, it means you become far more selective about which moments actually deserve your energy and which ones are better left to dissolve in the silence you choose not to break. The strength in this approach isn't about winning every exchange. It's about recognizing that most exchanges were never worth fighting in the first place. And that your silence, calmly held, often accomplishes more for your dignity than any argument you could have made in the heat of the moment. As we move into the final chapters ahead, it's worth pausing here to notice how much ground the principle of silence actually covers. It shapes how you're perceived the moment you walk into a room. It determines how much leverage you hold in a negotiation. It protects your dignity in moments of disrespect. It builds the quiet authority that makes people listen more closely the less often you speak. None of this required a single clever line, a rehearsed comeback, or an impressive vocabulary. It required only the discipline to resist the reflex that most people never question, the compulsion to fill every gap the moment it appears. What comes next builds directly on this foundation, moving from the interpersonal into something even more fundamental. How silence shapes your relationship with yourself and how the same restraint you've been practicing with others becomes eventually a permanent shift in how you move through the world. Chapter 11. Silence in Relationships. The space that deepens connection. There's a common assumption in close relationships, romantic partnerships, deep friendships, family bonds that intimacy is built primarily through talking, through sharing every thought, processing every feeling out loud and narrating the relationship constantly to keep it alive. And to a degree, communication genuinely matters. Avoidance and stonewalling can quietly poison a relationship over time. But there's a difference between healthy communication and compulsive verbal processing. And many people in their effort to be a good partner or friend tip into the second category without realizing it, filling every silence in the relationship with words, reassurance, seeking or narration until the relationship starts to feel less like a shared experience and more like a running commentary. The healthiest relationships, the ones that tend to last and deepen over years rather than burn out quickly, usually have a different quality to them. An ability to sit in comfortable silence together without either person feeling the need to perform connection constantly. Two people who can share a meal, a car ride, or an evening at home without filling every minute with conversation and still feel completely at ease are often experiencing a far deeper form of intimacy than two people who talk constantly but rarely just exist quietly in each other's presence. This comfortable silence signals something important, that the relationship doesn't require constant maintenance through words to feel secure. The bond itself is sturdy enough to hold quiet moments without anxiety creeping in. This becomes especially relevant in moments of conflict or emotional intensity within a relationship. The instinct, particularly for people who fear abandonment or rejection, is to talk through every disagreement immediately, exhaustively, until some kind of resolution is reached. Even if that resolution is rushed and incomplete. But sometimes the more mature response is to allow a difficult moment to sit in silence for a while, not as punishment or avoidance, but as a genuine pause that allows both people's nervous systems to settle before continuing the conversation with more clarity. Rushing to resolve every tension immediately through words often produces reactive half-considered statements that do more damage than the original disagreement. A calmer, more restrained approach, one willing to let a difficult moment breathe before addressing it fully, tends to produce far healthier long-term outcomes. There's also a specific dynamic worth naming in early-stage romantic attraction where restraint plays a particularly powerful role. Constant immediate availability. Responding to every message instantly. Sharing every thought the moment it occurs. Narrating every feeling of interest as soon as it develops tends to flatten the natural buildup of attraction that comes from a little space and unresolved curiosity. This isn't about playing games or deliberately withholding affection to manipulate someone's interest. It's about recognizing that healthy attraction, like most forms of interest discussed throughout this video, thrives on a small amount of space rather than total immediate saturation. Someone who maintains their own life, their own pace, and their own quiet confidence rather than restructuring their entire availability around a new interest tends to be perceived as more secure and ultimately more attractive than someone who abandons all restraint the moment they're interested in another person. Silence also plays a role in how respect is maintained within long-term relationships. Specifically, partners who have learned not to air every minor complaint the instant it arises, who can let small irritations pass without narrating every one of them out loud, tend to maintain a calmer, more respectful dynamic than partners who verbalize every fleeting frustration as it happens. This requires discernment obviously, because genuine recurring issues do need to be addressed directly rather than swallowed indefinitely. But the daily minor frictions that exist in any close relationship, the small annoyances that would otherwise accumulate into constant bickering if verbalized every single time, often dissolve naturally, if simply allowed to pass in silence, rather than being given the weight and permanence that comes from putting them into words. There is also something to be said for how silence functions during moments of shared joy or shared grief within a relationship. Moments where words often feel inadequate regardless of how carefully chosen they are. Sitting quietly with someone through a difficult loss. Simply being present without rushing to fill the space with comforting phrases often communicates more genuine care than any well-intentioned speech could. Likewise, sharing a moment of quiet pride or happiness together without narrating the feeling constantly allows the experience itself to remain the focus rather than the commentary surrounding it. Learning to trust silence in these emotionally significant moments rather than defaulting to words out of discomfort with the intensity of the moment is one of the most meaningful applications of everything this video has been building toward. There's a particular skill worth developing here specifically. The ability to simply be present with someone else's pain without trying to fix, explain, or immediately problem solve your way out of the discomfort it creates in you. Many people rush to fill a grieving friend's silence with advice, silver linings, or comparisons to their own experiences. Not necessarily out of insensitivity, but because sitting with someone else's raw emotion without offering a solution feels almost unbearably passive. But in most cases, what a person going through something difficult actually needs is not a solution. It's simply the felt experience of not being alone in the silence, of having someone willing to sit in the discomfort alongside them rather than rushing to resolve it. Learning to offer that kind of presence without needing to fill it with well-meaning words is one of the deepest forms of care one person can offer another. And it draws directly on every principle of restraint and composure this entire video has been developing. This same principle applies somewhat counterintuitively to celebrating someone else's success as well. When a friend or partner shares good news, the instinct is often to immediately match their excitement with a flood of questions, comparisons, or related stories of your own. Sometimes unintentionally shifting the focus away from their moment and onto the conversation itself. A more restrained response, one that allows their news to simply be received and acknowledged fully before the conversation naturally expands, often communicates deeper genuine investment in their happiness than an immediate talkative reaction does. This isn't about being reserved or unenthusiastic. It's about letting their moment breathe first, giving it the same respect you'd want your own significant news to receive rather than immediately folding it into a faster-paced exchange. This same restraint matters in how couples and close friends navigate everyday decision-making together as well. Constantly narrating every small preference, every minor irritation, every passing thought about the relationship itself can create a kind of exhausting hyperverbalization that leaves little room for the relationship to simply exist without constant processing. The healthiest dynamics tend to involve a natural balance. Open communication when something genuinely needs addressing, paired with a comfortable willingness to let smaller moments simply be experienced together without requiring commentary. This balance, more than any single conversation technique, is often what distinguishes relationships that feel effortless and steady from ones that feel perpetually exhausting, regardless of how much either partner genuinely cares about the other. Chapter 12. The Inner Silence. Mastering Your Mind. Before you master the room. Everything discussed so far in this video has focused on outward silence. The pauses you hold in conversation. The words you choose not to say. The reactions you choose not to display. But there is a deeper layer beneath all of it. One that ultimately determines how convincingly you can practice everything else. This is inner silence, the quieting of the constant internal chatter, self-doubt, anxious rehearsal, and reactive commentary that runs beneath the surface of most people's minds nearly every waking moment. You cannot convincingly project external calm for very long if your internal state remains chaotic, because eventually the gap between the two becomes visible, whether through a flicker of tension in your face, a slight tremor in your voice, or simply an exhaustion that comes from constantly managing an internal storm while performing external stillness. Most people's minds are almost never actually quiet. There is a near constant stream of internal narration running in the background, replaying past conversations, rehearsing future ones, judging our own performance, anticipating how others might judge us. This internal noise is exhausting, and more importantly, it actively undermines the external composure we've spent this entire video building. A person whose mind is racing internally, even if their outward behavior looks calm, tends to leak small signs of that internal chaos. A slightly delayed response, a subtle stiffness in posture, an inability to fully relax into a pause because part of their attention is still occupied by anxious internal commentary. Building genuine inner silence starts with recognizing how much of your internal dialogue is not actually productive thinking but anxious repetition dressed up as problem solving. Replaying an awkward conversation from 3 days ago for the 40th time is not helping you improve anything. It is simply a nervous system stuck in a loop, mistaking repetition for resolution. The first step in quieting this noise is simply noticing it without judgment. Catching yourself mid-loop and recognizing consciously that this particular thought pattern has already been fully processed and no longer requires further rehearsal. This sounds simple, almost too simple to matter. But the repeated practice of noticing and gently releasing these loops rather than following them further is one of the most effective ways to begin quieting the internal noise that constant mental chatter creates. Breath plays a far more significant role in this process than most people give it credit for. Shallow, rapid breathing, the kind most people default to without noticing, keeps the nervous system in a low-grade state of alertness, which in turn keeps the mind generating anxious, reactive thoughts almost automatically. Slower, deeper breathing sends a physiological signal to the nervous system that there is no immediate threat requiring hypervigilant thinking, which allows the internal chatter to naturally quiet down without any effort to force it into silence directly. This is why so many practices centered on calm and presence across countless traditions and disciplines begin with breath rather than with thought. You cannot think your way into a calmer mind nearly as effectively as you can breathe your way there. A simple practical version of this worth trying involves extending your exhale slightly longer than your inhale. A pattern shown consistently to activate the body's natural calming response. This doesn't require any special training or equipment, and it can be done discreetly in almost any situation. Before walking into a difficult meeting, in the moment right after receiving a provocative comment, in the pause before answering a question you weren't expecting. Building a habit of returning to this simple breath pattern during moments of rising tension gives you a physical anchor for everything discussed throughout this video. A way of accessing calm that doesn't depend on willpower alone, but works directly with your body's own physiology to make composure more accessible in the exact moments it matters most. There's also real value in scheduling deliberate periods of unstimulated quiet into your day. Time without music, podcasts, scrolling, or any external input competing for your attention. Most people fill every spare moment with stimulation specifically because sitting with their own unfiltered thoughts feels uncomfortable, sometimes unbearably so. But avoiding that discomfort indefinitely means your mind never gets the practice it needs to settle on its own without external distraction. Constantly propping it up, even 5 or 10 minutes a day of simply sitting without input, without a task, without a phone nearby gives your nervous system a chance to practice the exact same skill you've been building externally throughout this entire video. Existing without needing to fill every available space with noise. The connection between inner silence and outer presence becomes obvious once you experience it directly. A calmer internal state produces almost automatically a calmer external presence because you're no longer expending enormous amounts of energy managing internal chaos while simultaneously trying to project composure. The stillness stops being a performance and starts being an accurate reflection of what's actually happening inside you. This is the difference between someone who has memorized the outward behaviors of confidence and someone who has genuinely built the internal foundation that makes those behaviors effortless. Everything discussed in the previous chapters becomes exponentially easier once this internal work has been done because you are no longer fighting against your own anxious internal narration every time you try to hold a pause. Resist an urge to overexplain or sit calmly through an uncomfortable moment. It's worth adding that this internal work is never truly finished, and expecting a permanent unshakable state of inner calm is itself an unrealistic standard that sets most people up for frustration. The goal isn't to eliminate internal noise entirely, which is likely impossible for any human mind. The goal is to develop a different relationship with that noise. One where you notice it without being immediately hijacked by it. Where a racing thought can pass through your awareness without automatically dictating your next external action. This distinction between having anxious thoughts and being controlled by them is ultimately what separates genuine inner silence from the impossible fantasy of a perfectly quiet mind. And it's an achievable, sustainable goal for anyone willing to practice it consistently over time. There's a specific practice worth mentioning here that many people find useful in building this internal distinction. Sometimes described as the pause between stimulus and response. In any moment where something triggers a strong internal reaction, an insult, a piece of unexpected news, a wave of self-doubt, there is technically a gap, however small, between the trigger itself and your reaction to it. For most people, this gap is so brief it feels non-existent. The reaction seems to happen automatically and instantaneously. But with deliberate practice, that gap can actually be widened, even if only by a second or two. And within that widened gap lies your entire capacity for choice. Do you snap back defensively or do you pause? Do you spiral into anxious rumination or do you notice the spiral beginning and gently redirect your attention elsewhere? This widened gap is in many ways the entire mechanism underlying everything discussed throughout this video, and it is built exclusively through repeated practice in exactly these small uncomfortable moments. It's also worth noting that inner silence tends to be significantly harder to access during periods of genuine stress or crisis than during calm, ordinary days. And this is entirely normal rather than a sign of failure. Nobody maintains perfect internal composure during a genuine emergency, a major loss or an acute crisis. And expecting that of yourself is both unrealistic and frankly somewhat inhuman. The goal of building inner silence is not to become invulnerable to genuine difficulty, but to develop enough of a foundation that you can return to composure more quickly after a disruption than you once could. And that even during genuine turmoil, some small anchor of internal stillness remains accessible rather than being completely overwhelmed by the chaos of the moment. Chapter 13. Digital Silence. Why not responding immediately is power. Every principle discussed throughout this video, developed originally through centuries of in-person social dynamics, applies just as powerfully, if not more powerfully, to the digital world. Most of us now spend a significant portion of our lives inside. Text messages, emails, social media notifications. All of these have created a culture of expected instant response where silence, the very tool we've spent this entire video building, has become almost taboo in digital communication. Not responding within minutes to a message is often interpreted as rudeness, disinterest, or even a small social violation. And yet, the same principles of scarcity, composure, and restraint that make silence powerful in person, apply with just as much force here, arguably even more, because almost nobody applies them in this specific context. Consider what constant instant availability actually communicates about a person. Someone who responds to every message within seconds, regardless of what they were doing beforehand, signals, whether they intend or not, that their attention is fully available at all times, that nothing in their life takes priority over immediate response. This might feel considerate in the moment, but over time it subtly diminishes how that person's attention is valued by others. Attention that is always available becomes almost by definition less valuable than attention that is occasionally scarce. Someone who takes a few hours, sometimes even a day to respond thoughtfully, not out of rudeness, but because their life genuinely has other priorities occupying their time, tends to be perceived, whether consciously or not, as someone whose time and attention actually matter. This doesn't mean deliberately ignoring people as a manipulative tactic. Leaving messages unanswered specifically to seem more desirable or important. That approach, when it's transparently strategic rather than genuine, tends to read exactly as calculated as it actually is. And it damages trust rather than building respect. What we're describing instead is simply releasing the compulsive need to respond to every notification the instant it arrives, allowing your response time to reflect your actual life and priorities rather than an anxious compulsion to prove your availability constantly. If you're in the middle of something important, let the message wait. If you need time to think through a thoughtful response rather than a reactive one, take that time. This isn't about following an artificial waiting period as a strategy. It's about no longer letting your phone dictate the pace of your attention simply because a notification demands it. There's also a specific application of this principle. In disagreements or tense exchanges that happen over text or email, the written medium removes tone, facial expression, and immediate context, which means misunderstandings escalate faster in digital conflict than in-person conflict often does. The instinct in a heated text exchange is to respond immediately, matching the emotional intensity of whatever was just received. But taking even a short pause before responding to a tense message rather than firing back a reactive reply within seconds tends to produce far more measured, effective communication. Many arguments conducted entirely over text have escalated unnecessarily simply because both parties were responding at the speed of reflex rather than the speed of actual thought. And a single deliberate pause, even just stepping away from the phone for 10 or 15 minutes before responding, often prevents damage that would otherwise take much longer to repair. This principle extends into how you show up on social media as well. Though this deserves careful framing. Constantly posting, constantly commenting, constantly inserting your opinion into every trending conversation creates the same diminishing effect as talking too much in person. An oversaturation of your own presence that reduces the weight any individual post carries. Someone who posts occasionally, thoughtfully, rather than constantly narrating every moment of their life or opinion on every current event, tends to command more attention when they do post for exactly the same reasons discussed throughout this entire video. Scarcity creates value. Restraint creates presence. These principles didn't stop applying the moment communication moved from in-person conversation to digital platforms. If anything, in a world oversaturated with constant noise from nearly everyone, the person who exercises visible restraint stands out more dramatically than they ever could have in a purely offline world. There's one more layer worth naming here, which is the specific discomfort of leaving a notification unread or a message unanswered while you decide how to respond. Many people check a message the instant it arrives specifically to relieve the small anxiety of not knowing what it says and then feel compelled to respond immediately simply because they've already opened it. Practicing a small delay here, deliberately choosing not to open every notification the second it appears, protects you from this reactive cycle entirely. It preserves your ability to respond from a place of genuine choice rather than from the low-grade urgency that constant digital notification is specifically designed to create. There's also a broader pattern worth examining, which is how digital tools have trained an entire generation to associate any unanswered message with a small nagging discomfort, an open loop. The mind wants closed as quickly as possible. This isn't a personal failing. It's a predictable response to platforms deliberately engineered to maximize engagement through exactly this kind of low-grade urgency. Recognizing this design for what it is, a system built to exploit the same discomfort with unresolved silence we've been discussing throughout this entire video, gives you a choice most people never consciously make. You can either remain subject to that engineered urgency indefinitely, checking and responding on a schedule dictated entirely by notification design. Or you can deliberately reclaim the pause, treating your digital responses with the same intentional restraint you've been practicing in every other context this video has covered. The tools themselves haven't changed the underlying psychology of silence and scarcity. They've simply created a new arena where almost nobody thinks to apply it. Chapter 14. The reputation silence builds over time. Everything discussed throughout this video so far has focused on individual moments. A single pause, a single restrained response, a single conversation handled with composure rather than anxious chatter. But the true power of silence reveals itself not in any single interaction, but in the reputation it builds across dozens, hundreds, and eventually thousands of interactions over the course of months and years. A single moment of restraint is a small thing. A consistent pattern of restraint, practiced repeatedly across an entire life, becomes something people notice, remember, and eventually respect on an almost structural level. Independent of any single conversation, reputations are built primarily through pattern recognition. People form judgments about who you are not from any single data point but from the accumulated pattern of your behavior across time. Someone who occasionally holds a thoughtful pause but otherwise talks compulsively and reacts defensively to every provocation will not build a reputation for composure, because the pattern taken as a whole tells a different story than the occasional exception. But someone who consistently across dozens of interactions chooses restraint over reactive noise, chooses calm over anxious explanation, chooses a considered pause over an instant reply, builds an unmistakable reputation over time. One that eventually precedes them into every room they walk into, whether or not they've ever met the people there before. This is why the practices described throughout this entire video are not meant to be applied only in high-stakes moments, important negotiations, difficult confrontations, first impressions with people who matter. They are meant to become your default operating mode across ordinary everyday interactions as well, because reputation is built far more powerfully through consistency in small unremarkable moments than through occasional impressive performances in big ones. The colleague who is calm and measured only during important meetings but chaotic and reactive in every minor daily interaction will not be remembered as composed. The colleague who brings that same calm, restrained energy to every interaction, big or small, becomes known over time as someone whose presence itself signals stability. There's a compounding effect at work here that's worth understanding clearly. Every time you successfully practice restraint in a moment that would have previously triggered an anxious reactive response, you are not just influencing how that specific interaction unfolds. You are also reinforcing internally your own identity as someone capable of that restraint, which makes the next instance easier. And the one after that easier still. Simultaneously, everyone who witnesses that pattern of behavior, even in small, forgettable moments, is quietly updating their internal model of who you are. Filing away evidence that eventually solidifies into a settled impression, one that becomes remarkably difficult to shift once enough evidence has accumulated in its favor. This is how reputations become in a sense self-sustaining. Once enough people perceive you as calm, composed and restrained, that perception itself becomes part of how new people are introduced to you through the second-hand accounts of others long before they've had a chance to observe your behavior directly themselves. It's also worth acknowledging that building this kind of reputation takes real time. Often longer than people expect or would like. A single well-executed pause in a single conversation will not instantly transform how you're perceived. This is a practice built through repetition, through hundreds of small choices made consistently over months and years, gradually shifting not just how others see you, but how you see yourself. Patience with this process matters enormously because the temptation, especially after learning these principles for the first time, is to expect immediate transformation. What actually happens is slower and in many ways more durable. A gradual compounding shift nearly invisible in any single moment, but unmistakable when you look back after a year or two of consistent practice and realize that the anxious reactive person who needed to fill every silence has quietly become someone else entirely. There's also an important point about consistency across different types of relationships and different power dynamics. Some people practice composure beautifully with superiors or people they're trying to impress, but abandon it entirely with people they perceive as having less status, service workers, junior colleagues, family members they feel comfortable enough to be careless around. This inconsistency is noticed often more than people realize, and it undermines the reputation being built far more than an occasional lapse under genuine pressure. True composure, the kind that builds lasting respect rather than a performance reserved for an audience that matters, extends evenly across every interaction, regardless of who's on the other side of it. This evenness, more than any single impressive display, is often what ultimately separates a performed version of restraint from a genuinely internalized one. There's also a specific way that reputation, once established, begins to change the dynamics of new interactions before they even begin. When someone has already heard through mutual acquaintances or general reputation that you are calm, composed, and difficult to rattle, they often approach their first interaction with you slightly differently than they would approach a stranger with no such reputation. Sometimes this manifests as a subtle difference, a slight adjustment in how directly they challenge you, a small increase in the care taken with their words around you. This isn't about intimidation or people being afraid of you. It's simply the natural human tendency to calibrate behavior based on prior information. And a reputation for genuine composure tends to invite more thoughtful, respectful engagement from the very first moment, long before any of that composure has been directly demonstrated to the new person themselves. It's also worth noting that this kind of reputation once built requires ongoing maintenance rather than becoming a permanent guaranteed state. A single dramatic lapse, particularly a public one, can undo a meaningful portion of what took years to build, which is precisely why the consistency discussed throughout this chapter matters so much. This isn't meant to create anxiety about a single mistake destroying everything. Occasional lapses are human and generally forgiven, especially within a broader pattern of restraint. But it is a reminder that this practice is not something you complete once and then coast on indefinitely. It is closer to physical fitness than to a diploma, something maintained through continued practice rather than a fixed achievement locked in permanently after enough repetitions. Chapter 15. Becoming the person who never has to say a word. We began this video with a simple observation that the moment before you speak is not empty. It is loaded with power, and the people who understand this instinctively carry themselves differently than everyone else in the room over the past 14 chapters. We've dissected exactly why this is true. The psychology behind why silence unsettles people and invites projection. The discipline required to sit inside a pause without flinching. The way presence is built from nervous system regulation rather than performance. The strategic use of silence in conflict and negotiation. The mystery effect that makes withheld information more compelling than full disclosure. The quiet authority silence lends to leadership. The first impressions shaped entirely before a single meaningful word is spoken. The self-respect embedded in not explaining yourself to people who haven't earned that access. The deepened intimacy that comes from comfortable silence in close relationships. The internal quiet that must be built before external composure can ever feel genuine rather than performed. The digital applications of restraint in a world engineered for instant response. And finally, the reputation that consistent silence builds over time, compounding quietly until it becomes simply who you are. What ties all of this together is a single underlying truth, one worth sitting with as this video comes to a close. Respect is very rarely given to the person working hardest to earn it through words. It is almost always given instead to the person who appears not to need it at all, whose composure suggests an internal security so complete that external validation becomes almost beside the point. This is the paradox at the center of everything we've covered. The less you chase respect through explanation, justification, and constant verbal performance, the more naturally it arrives, drawn toward the stillness you've built, rather than repelled by the noise most people generate trying to secure it directly. None of what's been described in this video is about becoming cold, distant, or emotionally unavailable. Silence used well is not the absence of warmth, connection, or genuine expression. It is the removal of everything unnecessary surrounding those things. The anxious filler, the compulsive over-explanation, the reflexive reaction to every provocation. So that when you do speak, when you do react, when you do express something, it carries the full weight of having been chosen rather than spilled reflexively. This is not a video about saying less for its own sake. It is a video about making sure that everything you do say and everything you don't is genuinely intentional. It's worth acknowledging too that this entire framework is not about becoming a different person wearing a mask of composure that has nothing to do with who you actually are underneath it. The goal was never to erase your natural warmth, humor, or expressiveness in favor of some flattened emotionless version of yourself. Rather, everything covered in this video is about removing the anxious noise that has likely been obscuring your natural presence for years. The nervous chatter, the compulsive justification, the reflexive reactions born of insecurity rather than genuine feeling. Underneath all of that noise is very likely a more grounded, more compelling version of you that has simply never had the space to be fully visible, buried beneath habits, built from years of needing constant approval and reassurance from everyone around you. This video was never about building a new personality. It was about clearing away what was covering the one you already have. Building this into your life will not happen overnight. And that's worth accepting from the outset rather than expecting instant mastery. Every principle in this video runs directly against instincts that have likely been reinforced for your entire life. The urge to fill silence, the urge to explain yourself, the urge to react instantly to every provocation or piece of praise. Undoing those instincts takes deliberate repeated practice, small moments of discomfort tolerated again and again until they stop feeling like discomfort at all. And simply become your default way of moving through the world. Start small. Choose one conversation today where you let a pause exist, a beat longer than feels natural. Choose one moment where you resist the urge to justify a decision nobody actually questioned. Choose one instance of disrespect where you respond with calm silence instead of an immediate defense. These small deliberate choices repeated consistently are the entire foundation of everything this video has described. There will be setbacks along this path. Moments where the old habits reassert themselves, where you find yourself over-explaining something that needed no explanation or reacting instantly to a provocation you meant to sit with calmly instead. This is not evidence that the practice isn't working. It is simply evidence that you're human, unwinding patterns that took years to form and will naturally take time to fully release. What matters is not perfect execution in every single moment, but the overall trajectory across time, more restraint than the month before, more comfort with silence than the year before. A slow and steady accumulation that eventually becomes unmistakable both to you and to everyone who has watched you change. It's worth revisiting one final time the core distinction that has run beneath every chapter in this video. Silence practiced well is never about withdrawal, avoidance, or hiding from the world behind a wall of calculated quiet. It is in every application we've covered an act of trust. Trust that your worth doesn't depend on constant explanation. Trust that your presence doesn't require constant performance. Trust that the people who matter will recognize substance without you needing to announce it at every opportunity. This trust is not naive. It's built deliberately and gradually through the exact practices this video has laid out until it stops being something you have to consciously choose and simply becomes the way you move through the world. If there's a single habit worth carrying forward above all others from everything covered here, it's this. The next time you feel that familiar pull to fill a silence, to explain a decision nobody questioned, to react instantly to something that stung. Pause first. Not forever, not indefinitely, just long enough to actually choose your response rather than let anxiety choose it for you. That single pause practiced consistently enough is the entire foundation this whole video has been built on. Everything else, the presence, the respect, the quiet authority that makes people lean in rather than tune out, grows outward from that one small repeatable choice. The person who commands respect without ever raising their voice, without ever over-explaining, without ever needing to prove themselves through constant talking, is not born that way. They build it, choice by choice, pause by pause, across countless ordinary moments most people never think twice about. That same capacity exists in you right now, waiting beneath the anxious habits you've likely carried for years. The only thing separating you from becoming that person is practice, patience, and the willingness to sit inside a silence long enough to let it start working in your favor. Start today and give it time. The respect you're looking for was never going to come from anything you said. It was always going to come from everything you didn't need.